Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Denmark 101. I'm thrilled to try and explain the difference between the Nordics and the Scandinavians in today's episode. So, if you heard both of those terms, you probably assume that the two are interchangeable. What are the Danes? Are they Nordic? Are they Scandinavian? Well, where it gets confusing is they are both. But the Finns, would they be Scandinavian? Would they be Nordic? What would they be? The Finns would actually be Nordic, but they would not be Scandinavian. Now the reason for this is that the Scandinavians are the Danes, the Norwegians, and the Swedes. Only those three. But that gets a little bit more confusing because you have the Scandinavian peninsula, which is that big, long thing that looks slightly phallic, that comes down and that is where Norway and Sweden rest. So you would think that Scandinavia might only be Norway and Sweden. But no, we got Denmark down here that's not on the Scandinavian peninsula, but is most assuredly Scandinavian. But it's still a little bit more complicated than that. So the Nordics, the traditional Nordics, we'll call that, are Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and then Finland, and then typically Iceland. But you can also kind of include the Faroe Islands. But then there's kind of like the Nordics plus, and these are kind of like the Nordics weird cousins, or not weird cousins, but I guess slightly influenced and associated cousins. And these are areas like the Orkney Islands, and then also Estonia. You would really never hear these referenced as Nordic. But the Estonians in particular, which are very close to the Finns in a lot of ways, though obviously very distinctly Estonian in their own way, they share some language and things like that, have historically had a very complicated relationship with the rest of the Nordic countries, and are heavily Nordic influenced. They might, depending on who you talk to, even consider themselves as somewhat Nordic. Then if you hop over to the other side and you get to the Scottish, which is where the Orkney Islands are. If you go way back, the Orkneys are very Scandinavian, very Nordic in feel. So the Nordics, or the Orkneys and the Shetlands, which fall under the UK, they have a lot of old Viking, old Norse, old Nordic architecture, ethnically or genetically. They're very closely associated. Architecturally, culturally, a lot of this stuff, they were kind of settled by, and the dominant groups there were Nordic for a long time. So they are not Nordic, but they do have these strong influences. But so if we jump back, it also gets really complicated with the Faroese, and I never quite know where to put the Faroese and the Greenlanders, because they are, the Faroese more so, but they could be considered Nordic, right? Kind of like Iceland. But both the Faroe Islands and Greenland are under the Danish banner. They are part of the greater Danish kingdom, even though they're their own standalone client kingdoms. So they share the culture, that side of it, and so that depends on if you're talking about Nordic, like Nordic culture, or are you talking about purely Nordic geography? So again, if you want to just be really safe about it, you say that the Scandinavians are the Danes, the Norwegians, and the Swedes, that the Nordics are those three with Iceland and Finland as the bonus countries, but be aware that there are some nuances in there that make the whole thing quite confusing. So where do you fall when if you have a Nordic background? That can also be quite confusing, right? Especially if you go back in history, because the historical side of it gets kind of cool. And I suspect, and I'm not positive, but that's also where Denmark being part of Scandinavia comes in, because you had Norway, which was for a long time part of Denmark. So Denmark got to cheat and kind of be part of both. Anyway, hope that clears it up. As always, thank you for tuning in to Denmark 101. Please subscribe, please leave a comment, and I would love to hear your questions. I'm always looking at new things to cover.